Well, good afternoon if you are in Newton, Massachusetts, Poughkeepsie, New York, anywhere in the Americas, or good morning in part of the Americas, good evening to people listening around the world, or good morning. Special love to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong. We are with you. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. My guest today is someone I've never met personally, but whose work I've admired for a very, very long time. He is Keith Lockhart. He is the conductor, perhaps your title is music director, of the Boston Pops Orchestra, which is a venerable institution, not only in Boston, but throughout the world. So Keith, welcome.
Thank you, Fred. It's great to join you, and great, you're right, to finally meet you.
Yeah. I'm going to start, and you chime in, please, with a bit of the history of the Boston Pops Orchestra. The Boston Symphony Orchestra, which is one of our great orchestras, was founded in 1881. Very soon thereafter, the people who ran it at that time had the desire to bring music to more people who may not get into classical, let's say the very high classical, Bruckner, you name it, but music that would appeal to them, which is not to talk down to them, but it's really to select music on programs that may bring people to classical music. And that happened in 1885, and they were called promenade concerts. And by 1900, it was named Pops from popular. Is that name a burden in any way?
To me personally, or to the institution? Probably
Both.
a little bit of each. It's a funny thing. You're absolutely right, dead on about the reasons behind its founding. On its surface, the Boston Symphony founded the Boston Pops was they were trying to extend the season for the players, which at that point was, I believe, around 20 weeks. And the problem was the entire orchestra at that point was German. They all decamped back to Europe as soon as the season was over, and they had an attrition rate of like 50% each year. So they thought if they could have a longer season, then of course they'd have better player retention. But I think you're right. There's more to it than that. Boston is the first city in this country to have a public library and to have public schools. And I like to refer to the Boston Pops as America's first public orchestra. And the whole idea was expanding the base of support, expanding the number of people for whom the orchestra meant something. The name Pops, which, as you said, derived from popular, some people think it derived from the popping of the champagne corks, certainly allowed it to feel to a lot of people, I think, less imposing than particularly at the end of the 19th century, incredibly erudite and rarefied world of classical music in the United States. But you're right. From my point of view, sometimes people say, "Oh, you're a pops conductor," as if that were some sort of subspecies. And I suppose that, music is music, and good music is good music. Arthur Fiedler had a wonderful quote that I steal all the time. He said, "We only play one kind of music at the Boston Pops, the interesting kind." And here's a man who was known for, putting on funny hats and conducting Sousa, but also conducted the American premiere of Schwanendreher, for instance.
So because we have listeners around the world, Arthur Fiedler was music director. He was one of the 17 conductors who's led the orchestra from 1930 to 1979. We're going to get back to Arthur Fiedler in a bit. But what I would like listeners also to know, if you've not been to Boston, it's a wonderful city. It's a very American city in ways that people who might live in Dallas or Chicago or Denver might not accept. But if I think of a very American city, I think of Boston, because it was the cradle, along with Philadelphia, of many of the things in the country. And Bostonians believe in academia, believe in excellence, in hospitals, in music, in schools, and just about everything, even in baseball, which I have an issue with, but in every
Yankees fan, are you?
Yes, sir. But
well,
no,
I grew up in upstate New York, but I was lucky enough to be a Mets fan, so I made the transition easier when I moved here.
Actually, let's address this issue right now about Boston Red Sox and New York Yankees, because they're both classical. If we think of classical music, if we think of classical baseball, the Red Sox and the Yankees are two of the original teams. And I know you know, Keith, but many listeners may not know there's something called the curse of the Bambino. Babe Ruth was a great baseball player, and he was on the Boston Red Sox, and he was sent to the Yankees, I believe, in 1923. They built Yankee Stadium, which was known as the house that Ruth built. And so for many years, the Yankees were the great team because they had the greatest player. But when it was proposed, I believe in the 1930s, to create a wonderful music festival in Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires called Tanglewood, it was offered to the New York Philharmonic, which stupidly said, no, thank you. And so the Boston Symphony was approached, and the Boston Symphony has this magnificent festival that the New York Philharmonic is not a part of. So I see this as the revenge for Babe Ruth.
Well, it's kind of the reversing the curse, isn't it?
Exactly.
But the New York Philharmonic has done better over this last century than the Red Sox did, at least until the last couple of decades.
Until 1986, I believe was the year. But anyway, enough with baseball, which love it though I do. Please talk about Symphony Hall in Boston, which is a magnificent place to make music. And then tell me, where did the Pops Orchestra make music originally, and where does it go to make music?
Well, the Symphony Hall is often referred to, certainly in this country, as one of the world's great halls. It was one of the first halls anywhere that was built using the rather newfangled science of acoustical engineering at the end of the 19th century. It opened in 1900, and even though it's, as I said, was based on actual measurements and reflection times and that sort of thing, its models were the Musikverein in Vienna and the Concertgebouw and the old Leipzig Gewandhaus. Actually, as a result, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous space in typical New England fashion. They built they said, well, this is just about music. So they built basically a hall with hardly any backstage facilities, hardly any wonderful public areas outside of the hall. And we've always had a problem with that. When you look at the gorgeous new spaces, for instance, that the New York Philharmonic now has outside of its hall and the small hall attached to it, we have a very puritanical hall. It's fairly unadorned. It's a place that you just go to hear great music. When the Pops started, the symphony and Pops were not playing in Symphony Hall yet. I'm trying to remember the name of the venue. That is long gone. But Symphony Hall was, when it opened in 1900, was actually designed to be a venue for both the symphony and the Pops. That is, it actually had a system, elevator system within the hall to allow us to flip the auditorium seating and replace it with the Pops tables, because the Pops has historically played with a nod to outdoor, beer garden concerts in Europe, has always played with tables and refreshments for the audience to kind of, again, lighten the way that we present music to them.
It has been a number of years since I've been in Symphony Hall. I frankly, more recently, have been in both the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam and the Musikverein in Vienna. They're different shapes. They're both, I think you'd call them shoebox, but the Concertgebouw in Vienna, in Amsterdam, has a section behind where the audience can sit, just the way the new hall, the David Geffen Hall in New York, has a smaller section like that. Remind me what Boston has.
Boston has a big set of organ pipes and an actually rather small stage with no on stage or behind stage, upstage seating. I love upstage seating. It takes some getting used to. I hadn't performed in that many spaces that had that until but when I first took my old orchestra, the Utah Symphony, on a European tour, I was all of a sudden in a lot of places where you have people looking at you. And for a conductor who gets this wonderful opportunity to turn their back on the audience and just deal with their colleagues, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I guess I probably should get rid of that frown. So
I've been sitting all around David Geffen Hall to get a sense of the acoustics in different places. And twice already, once for Susanna Melke, once for Michael Tilson Thomas, I sat in the section behind the orchestra because I wanted to watch the conductors. And the seat that I chose both times, just coincidentally, happened to be very close to where the trumpeter was. And I used my binoculars not to look at the maestro, but to read the trumpet part as he played. And that was a fascinating little moment that I could follow with him as he played when he turned the page and so on, and when he did repeats. And I recommend this to people who really might be into a particular instrument. I'm not a trumpet player, but that's where I wound up. And it was really fascinating to understand how one player interacts with the whole orchestra and when his moment comes.
It's a wonderful, it is something that I said I wish we had the advantage of in Boston. But on top of that, it's something that we in the classical music performing industry really need to have. And that is, how do we have places where people can really experience viscerally the immediacy of making music? For so many years, the whole proscenium idea was that you pull the orchestra away and they live in a different space from the audience. And it was shocking when anybody at the Pops, for instance, would turn around and talk to the audience, because we bow stiffly to the audience and then we turn away from them. But I think one thing that we really suffer from these days in terms of attracting new live audiences is that feeling that it's a distanced kind of thing. And when you're really focusing, when you can focus on one player and what effort they put into it, or one group of players, or how this whole thing comes together, the analogy that comes to my mind is that I took my 11-year-old son and our family to the Boston Celtics, another renowned team, but in basketball. And he had only been to one game before, and it was way up in the nosebleed seats. And this time I pulled some strings and I got courtside right under the basket. And the difference, the impact that game makes is so huge when you see the bodies in motion and you can almost reach out and touch them and the ball is flying right by your head, than it is when you could have to look at it with opera glasses.
I have to ask, how does a conductor pull strings?
Well, it's when you've been in the same town with a very popular organization for 28 years, people.
The Boston Pops Orchestra has a very large national profile, and certainly international too, but especially national in the United States. In Washington, we have our National Symphony Orchestra. John Andrea Noceda is the conductor. And yes, that's in the Kennedy Center. And yes, Washington is the capital of the nation. But in terms of imagery, I think because the Boston Pops Orchestra is so old and venerable, that you lived in Utah, the same with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. There are certain institutions that go well beyond their cities and are known nationally. And the Boston Pops is one of those. Touring is a great big part of your function, you and your orchestra. Talk about its relationship to the whole nation and how it brings Boston as a brand, let's say, to the nation.
Well, you're right. It is. I'd like to think of the Boston Pops as really being our national orchestra. I mean, there are obviously great and more traditional symphonic ensembles all over the country, but there's a regionalism in our country just because of the sheer size of it. And you'd never get people in New York or Boston or Cleveland or Philadelphia or Los Angeles or even San Francisco to say, well, those guys' orchestra, that's our national orchestra. But we are unique, venerable, yes, but also of the whole 20th century was seeded, starting with Fiedler in 1930, with a real marketing of that brand all the way across the country, and to a lesser extent in Asia and Europe, through millions of recordings. I mean, within about 10 years after the orchestra started recording in 1932, there was hardly a Victrola that didn't have a Boston Pops album on it. And then with TV, with the Evening of Pop starting in 1970, which was a totally unique thing at that point. One of the wonderful things about going on tour with the orchestra, and you're right, it has been very important. I have done something like a year worth of touring in my 28 years there. I've been on the road a lot with my colleagues. Almost all of that has been domestic. There have been 4 tours to Japan, and knocking on wood, we're supposed to go back there in October, which we're of course very excited about. We have not toured since the pandemic shut down, and that hurts your national branding.
Yeah.
But when I first went on tour with the orchestra, a couple of big sweeping, sea to shining seas sort of tours in the mid 90s, I had people coming up to me when we play a venue, say in Colorado, who had driven there from Oklahoma. And they drove there and had to come backstage, and they had to tell me that when they grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, the Evening of Pops was their only connection to this high art culture, and that it was something that they were very hungry for, that their parents had made them watch, but they ended up saying it was, it transformed me. And hearing stories like that from people who don't live in the big urban areas was really cool. But yes, the Boston Pops is the national orchestra, if you can dare to say that. We like to call it America's orchestra. You can say that about the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. You could probably also say that about the Metropolitan Opera, just because of the sheer size of the institution, and because of what they've done with the live streaming into the theaters.
Yeah. Let's now talk about Arthur Fiedler. I didn't know Arthur Fiedler, but I knew his daughter Johanna very well, because when I was performance manager of the Metropolitan Opera, Johanna was the press, I forget her exact title. She was not press director initially, she became that. But we worked together every single day for years. And she knew obviously a great deal about music, but she never discussed her father, and I never asked her about her father. But I grew up in New York.
It was a difficult relationship.
It was a difficult that she wrote about, so I think people can find that. She unfortunately is no longer with us, but she knew music backwards and forwards, to put it mildly, which was part of what made her so good at her job at the Met. But did you ever meet Arthur Fiedler? Did you know him at all?
I never met Arthur Fiedler. I was, I suppose, just about 21 when he passed away, but I had never seen the Pops live. I certainly watched Evening of Pops like everybody did in the mid 1970s. And it's funny because my connection, I had met Johanna before a couple of times in various social events. It was very strange because she actually, though she continued to actually help fund some of the free concerts we do down on the Esplanade very generously. She, I think, had a relationship with the Pops in the post her father era that kind of reflected her relationship with her father. The one I do know, though, is the youngest son, Peter, who lived and raised his kids in this town and was a vice president at Boston University for many years. And he is, the funniest thing about him is, of course, everybody, at least every American who grew up at a certain time, knows exactly what Arthur Fiedler looked like. Well, Peter, now that he is about 70, looks exactly like Arthur Fiedler. And by the way, you have a passing resemblance there too. It's the mustache.
Passing. I think we have very different temperaments and the aura that we project. I, of course, saw him on TV. I don't think I ever attended a performance of the Boston Pops with him conducting. I did with John Williams, and I have with you. John Williams is a very famous composer, also a conductor. He recently turned 90. He's known for his collaboration, I think, on 26 films with Steven Spielberg. But he's also quite the conductor. And after the death of Arthur Fiedler, John Williams came to Boston and became the conductor of the Boston Pops. Would you talk about him? Because yes. I should say, by the way, to listeners, that I always ask my guests to mention things from the Adagio catalog that pleases them. And one of them is a work by John Williams, The Devil's Dance, from the film The Witches of Eastwick.
Well, I figured I had to look through the catalog and put at least a couple of things that I had actually conducted in the Adagio catalog out there. John is he's, there are a few people who I can truly say that I feel blessed to have had close working relationships who are, obviously in this business we work with extraordinary people all the time, but are really geniuses, really legendary people who will outlive all of us in the impact that they made. And one of them is, for me, is Stephen Sondheim, whom I had the great pleasure to work with quite a bit. And another one of them is John. And John has been a regular presence, an ongoing presence now since I took the job 28 years ago. He is still on the scene. Up till about a decade ago or so, he used to come back and do some concerts in the Boston Pop seasons in Boston. Now he mostly confines his time to Tanglewood. But he is always a phone call away. The first time I met John, I never met him either. I met him the night before the press conference announcing my appointment. They thought maybe we should talk. They snuck me up to his suite at the Four Seasons, and we had dinner up there. And I remember my first impression of him was, what an amazingly quiet and humble sort of person this is. But still, when he says something, you listen to it. And the big piece of advice, my big takeaway from him then was, he said, if I can give you one piece of advice. I said, yes, please. Here I am, barely 35 years old, coming from being the associate conductor of Cincinnati Symphony and the Cincinnati Pops to taking this role, which, will have press outside your door and photographers on the roofs and things like that. He said, don't be in too big a hurry to make this orchestra, to stamp this orchestra with your stamp. He said, this orchestra is older and bigger than either of us, not just you, but me too. And the temptation when you're young is to try to differentiate yourself. And look, I was coming in as, a young musician, confident of my skills to do, at least the conducting parts of the job, but replacing somebody who at that point he wasn't as much of a legend as John Williams is now, but he was well on his way. He'd done Jaws and Indiana Jones and Star Wars, and and so the temptation is to come in and say, well, I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it this way, because people will then know it's my band. And so I bit my tongue and didn't do that. And I think that was really good. He said, because then people will perceive you as, a faithful steward of this institution. And eventually it's going to reflect your choices anyway. So he has always been, ever since, a wonderful mentor, friend, older colleague. He's 91 years old now.
Yeah.
He's working on his next movie project. He keeps making noises about retiring, but then somebody throws something, especially Steven Spielberg, sticks something interesting in front of him. He just did The Fabelmans. He's doing the new Indiana Jones movie that's coming out this summer. And he's just amazing. But still, the funny thing is for my kids is that they say, well, what do you have to do today? I said, I have to call John Williams. And like they, from the time they can play piano, they've been picking out themes on. And they said, you can talk, you have his phone number. So, compared to that, Celtics tickets are easy. So
a question came to me that I just never thought of before. As listeners know, the Boston Pops Orchestra is made up primarily of players from the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And Boston Symphony has always had its music director for many years, who was Seiji Osawa. Now it's Anders Nelson's, but they too have had their music director. I wonder what it's like for them and what it's like for the two conductors, who in effect share the same players, but maybe the players react differently, work differently with the conductor of the Boston Symphony and the conductor of the Boston Pops, even though they're the same musicians.
Well, as I said before, to some extent, music is music and performance is performance. But yes, it is. And one of the things that has allowed it to really be, two different organizations that use the same resources is that the seasons have largely been very distinct. In many orchestras, the kind of Pops type repertoire shows are just sprinkled all the way through the season. But my time with them has been confined over the years for a spring pop season, which varies from 6 to 10 weeks over the years in May, June, July, and the holiday pops season, which is a very intense, like 35 concerts in 3 weeks. And the rest of
So
the
in
time,
December, January, basically.
yes, or
Okay.
actually, yeah, pretty much. It's and the rest of the time they are largely enfranchised as the Boston Symphony, and our relationships are definitely different. Obviously, we're very different people they're working for. And when I came in, Seiji had already been here over 2 decades. And then with Andres, we now have a wonderful, a world-respected music director who is 20 years younger than I am. And we have Andres and I have a very interesting relationship that way too, because he is a brilliant musician, but I have a lot of on the ground experience of working in this business for a very long time. And so he'll, I'll ask him things and then he'll say, "What do you think I should do about that?" I was like, "Hey, you're the boss." That's it's kind of fun in a way. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that I've been able to enjoy such a long and positive relationship here is that I am not the boss. I am the conductor of the Boston Pops. I don't make the personnel decisions, which are the hardest thing that any music director has. I've done that before, but here it's nice to be able to to be a colleague to the players who still treat me with, the respect due the office, I suppose. But it's also a very different working situation when you're doing subscription concerts with an orchestra, doing, Shostakovich recording cycle, or some brand new commissions, or a Thomas Ades commission. It is a very, very focused week with 4 rehearsals, 2 or 3 concerts, everything focused on making that music as pristine as it can be, especially when the recorders are, the tape is rolling. The Pops, we use the same skill sets of the orchestra to produce much more product in a short period of time. Our weeks are, generally speaking, 2 or 3 rehearsals with 5 concerts attached to them, 2.5 different programs over that period of time. And that means that we have to use, I used to say this, and not meaning disparagement to our product, is that as opposed to being an executive chef at a gourmet restaurant, in this job, I'm more of a really good short order cook. Because that's a skill in itself. You have to make really good stuff, but you can't worry so much about the presentation on the plate.
Well, I'm gonna give you a promotion for short order cook to chef de cuisine, which would actually be the title. There's executive chef and there's chef de cuisine. We're gonna get back to food in a bit for a reason that I think you know. But you one more question about repertory, and then I want to talk about Stephen Sondheim. In terms of planning a season, there are popular works that the Pops Orchestra would be likely to do, like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, maybe Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Certain works that we think of as the Dvorak Nine, things like that. Now, also the Boston Symphony and Andres Nelson's, or perhaps guest conductors, would want to do those works in their programming. How does it work in terms of programming to decide who plays what when, so that Boston audiences don't get the same work 3 times in a season?
Well, it's not that much of a problem. For one thing, though, we certainly, over my time, the mix of music has changed since Fiedler's time, because our audience has changed since Fiedler's time. It has become more thematically driven. When I first came to the orchestra, even all they did was just said the Boston Pops is playing Tuesday and they're playing Wednesday and they're playing Thursday. They didn't even discuss what was on the program. And now it's highly thematic. We'll have a Broadway night. This season, for instance, we're doing something that we commissioned before the shutdown, the musical Ragtime in a concert form that Terrence McNally and Flaherty and Ahrens worked with us to create. And that draws a very Broadway crowd. And we'll do a Celtic night. We'll do an indie rock band night with us, Guster, which is a Boston band that is now 26, 27 years old itself. And we will always make sure that we try to keep the core of what we do, which is great music written for orchestra. And so certainly we have done parts of, we wouldn't do an entire Beethoven 9 because that's the province of the symphony, but we've done the last movement of Beethoven 9. We've done parts of Bartok Concerto for Orchestra and Rite of Spring, and we've done Afternoon. So we try to play a lot of great things because we want to expose audiences to those things. But generally speaking, our audience has very little crossover still, which is really not a bad thing. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, everybody was kind of like, when people started coming up with excuses in other orchestras and other regions to have their own pop series, the idea was that it was training wheels for becoming a full-time Bruckner lover, and and that didn't prove to be the case, actually. But I don't think it needs to. I don't think that this music is an aspirational thing, that if you started off by listening to Rodgers and Hammerstein, eventually you will want to hear Mahler 7. If you do, that's great. But
Mahler 4th, maybe, not the 7th.
Yes, exactly. I think you should start a little easier. If you do, that's great. But the idea that we are bringing quality music played by a great orchestra to the widest group of people, and not just to the same people who are going to the symphony the rest of the year, I think is one of the primary goals. So if a lot of times, actually, if Andres programs something, and again, I told you we're rather rehearsal short, I applaud that, because it means the piece is pre-rehearsed to a certain extent, and I can say, I'm going to pull that and do this in a totally different context, surrounded by completely different music, and the players will already have a working knowledge of it. I mean, we can read standard repertoire, with each other till the cows come home, but if you're doing something that's particularly thorny, I don't really have the time to do it from the ground up.
Yeah. Let's go to Stephen Sondheim. For people around the world who may not know, Stephen Sondheim was one of the greatest geniuses in the history of the American musical theater. I say that, and not Broadway, but it's Broadway too. He had a very long career. He went to college in Massachusetts at Williams College. He was from New York. He had parent problems, to put it mildly. He came under the wing of Oscar Hammerstein. He really early on had training. He had an incredible gift for language and wrote the libretto for West Side Story with a youngish Leonard Bernstein and Arthur Lawrence and Jerome Robbins. And then he went on to do his own musicals. And each musical, I think it's fair to say, and you can disagree, Keith, was different from the musical before. So that to define a Sondheim musical, I know that my favorite Sondheim musical, without a doubt, is Follies. But there are many people who don't like Follies, who love Sweeney Todd, or Sunday in the Park with George, or Into the Woods, or all of these wonderful works, Assassins, A Little Night Music. They're all brilliant, and there are some that I really love, and Follies, I think, is one of the 2 or 3 greatest musicals ever written. I love it. I traveled the world to see performances of it, and it's kind of like Don Giovanni, that every time you cast it, depending who the casting is, it takes on a whole other flavor. And to me, it's a fascinating show. But I grew up in musical theater with a musical family. I've worked in opera and everything for my whole life. And in New York City, the arts community tends to meet and know one another. When Sondheim died, I believe in November of 2021, everybody online and elsewhere were posting letters from him, memories of Steve, and so on. And people wrote to me and said, tell us about when you knew Sondheim. I think I'm the only person in New York who works in the arts who never met Stephen Sondheim. So,
wow.
Ever. And I know that he was not the biggest lover of opera, but I went constantly to musical theater. I saw all of his shows. The Company was another show. There are many, many of these masterpieces, but we never met. And I didn't know that you worked with them. So please talk about Sondheim, the artist, the man you worked with, what you did with him.
Well, yes. I mean, I grew up as a big music theater lover. I was really really a Broadway guy. And interestingly enough, when I finished my grad work in conducting and was looking for that elusive first assistant conductor position, I ended up staying in Pittsburgh, where I finished my work at Carnegie Mellon and joining the faculty there. And Carnegie Mellon is perhaps even better known as a great music theater and drama school than it is as a great music school. So I started doing a lot of really high-end musical theater with people who ended up 5 years later on Broadway themselves, with great casts and a lot more freedom than you have in the commercial world. So for most of the 80s, until I got my position in Cincinnati, my primary credits were doing kind of high-end musical theater, long runs of things like Candide, and then in 1985, Sweeney Todd, 40 performances of it. Then in 1986, the first regional production of Sunday in the Park, because that show didn't tour nationally initially because of the concept. For people who don't know it, it involved like ridiculous making a three-dimensional picture out of the famous Seurat painting that involved having to convert the entire stage and things like that. So it didn't go in a.
And just for audience reference, that painting is in the Art Institute of Chicago.
It is. But so I actually dealt with him, actually communicated with him indirectly at that point. That's 1986 or so. And then fast forward, and I've worked with so many people who were very important in the world of Stephen Sondheim's musicals. I did a lot over the years with Bernadette Peters. A lot. I was Mandy Patinkin's touring conductor before I became the conductor of the Boston Pops. And so we had all these connections. The first time I actually met him was we were planning a PBS show that actually never happened, that was celebrating, how old was he when he died? 92?
91, 92, yeah. He was born in 1930.
So this would have been 30, so it would have been probably his 70th birthday in 2000. We were talking to producers about doing a show that never got off the ground. We were communicating back and forth through his people, and basically one day he picked up a phone and called me. He said, well, I know of you, and I know you've worked with a lot of people whom I admire. So he said, why don't you come down and talk to me about it? So I was like, me? And I got on a train and went down to New York and knocked on his door and sat in his living room amidst all those puzzles and mechanical toys and the things that fascinated him, and talked to him for 2 hours that seemed to go by in about 5 minutes. And I had this idea. I said, I'm sitting here, talking. It's like my dinner with Andre. It's like my dinner with Shakespeare. It's who would you have dinner with? I mean, he was he's a fairly reticent kind of guy. He wasn't a big, open and engaging guy, but he was really warm and really sincere. And after that, there were 4 or 5 more times where we had an opportunity to connect directly. The last one of which was there was a show done for him a few years ago in the piano form called Sondheim on Sondheim, which used interviews and interwove interviews with him about the creative process and about his amazingly horrible problems with his mother and all those things. I asked actually if they would consider allowing us to do an orchestrated version of the same show, and they did. And Michael Starobin did the orchestrations to match them all up, because of course they come from different pit sizes and all that. And the result premiered in Boston. What was that? I guess 2017, and then in Tanglewood, and he came up to Tanglewood to hear it. And that was the last time I saw him. But as I said, you're absolutely right. Every one of those shows is different. Some of us, gravitate toward one more than the other. But even the ones that were perceived to be failures, are admirable, because they all do something extraordinary. And there's nobody you can say that about. Even the great like Rodgers and Hammerstein, you can't say all their shows are totally different. There
True.
was a formulaic thing that he just exploded.
I would say that with Oscar Hammerstein, the second, I believe, and this is in no way a criticism, there was a moral core to his libretti and to his scores. And Richard Rodgers, to me, wrote incredibly beautiful music.
Mm-hmm.
And he responded to the morality, to the sense of justice that was embedded in many of the libretti by Oscar Hammerstein. Sondheim was, I think, brilliant in characterization, from the nicest people to the most horrendous people. That he could have a barber who would slit people's necks. He could have the person who killed Abraham Lincoln. He could have those people. And then he can have the kindest people, Sally in Follies, all kinds of people in Follies. And it, to me, reflected a knowledge of human nature that he was then able to translate in his words and music, because in most cases, he wrote the words and the music. Not every case, but most cases.
Some great shows where he did one or the other too, but
yeah.
And
when he died, he had gone to, I don't know if it was a final dress rehearsal, an opening performance of his show Company that had a production in London that I actually saw in London before New York. And not my favorite Sondheim musical, I confess. I saw it as a 14-year-old in 1970, and I just didn't get it. But I know that I was seeing Lane Stritch and people like that. And I embrace it, but it's not my favorite Sondheim work. But the one that followed was Follies, which I always am fascinated how he could go from this story of contemporary New Yorkers in their 30s to a memory show about basically the American theater, with the most magnificent music that reflected each character very well. But since Company in New York, we have had a wonderful revival of Into the Woods. There's now an excellent revival of Sweeney Todd. And one of his, quote, failures, Merrily We Roll Along, was done at the New York Theater Workshop with Daniel Radcliffe and is now coming to Broadway. So
Daniel Radcliffe is Bobby. It's this Merrily, right? Yeah,
yes.
But Merrily has been shown, I think, to work much better than people thought it did when it premiered. And it has an incredible score, and just the concept is gut-wrenching for people who don't know it. It's a show that runs in reverse, and you see three former best friends at each other's throats and their lives in ruins, and then you deconstruct back to where, so the reprises happen before the original song does, and you see at the end, three optimistic young people who express their love for each other and they're just looking forward to nothing but a wonderful and perfect life, boundless optimism. And it's heartbreaking because you see what happened to that life.
I'm going to ask you the same question twice. First time, as Keith Lockhart, the man, not the conductor, do you have a favorite Sondheim musical?
It's either Follies or Sunday in the Park.
Why in these?
Because the Follies is, I think, where I first discovered his ability, the strength of characterization, the way that he differentiates the four main characters in that show. The way that he understood, for someone who spent most of his life alone, was a gay man who actually had a long-term partner, but fairly late on in his life.
Later in life, actually.
Somebody who had experienced firsthand so few very close, intimate relationships seemed maybe better at objectively looking at how those things happen. And he actually said something to that effect himself. Sunday in the Park, because I think it speaks a lot to performing artists. I think those of us who look at our lives and look at the things we've done and the things we've screwed up, and the divorces and the times when we weren't paying enough attention to the world around us because we
Yeah.
thought this is what we have to do. A little more perspective now. I'm not as young as Surratt was by far, or as I was at that point. You realize that there can be room for more things in your life.
Yeah.
And but there is that kind of feeling of needing to make like monastic devotion to, and plus the score is lush and
Well, that was
gorgeous.
my second question. Keith Lockhart, the conductor. Do you have a favorite Sondheim?
Sweeney,
Sweeney Todd. Why?
because I think that it is musically, in terms of its construction, its cohesion, its use of thematic stuff and almost kind of leitmotif sort of work, and the rawness, the graininess, the fact that it sometimes sounds like downright bar-talky, is I think it is really should be considered an opera. I mean, it really is, has a very thin dialogue book and is mostly could almost be performed without it.
And it has been done in opera houses. Bryn Terfel, the Welsh bass baritone, has been a great Sweeney, and I've seen it in opera houses. But then in Europe, I've seen West Side Story and Hello Dolly in opera houses. So West Side Story at La Scala. So
well, there are those transcendent American musical theater works that really, I think, hit that, whatever we call a qualitative place that we say this deserves to be viewed as an opera and not as an entertainment. I mean, that's one of them. Street Scene is one of them.
Yes.
I'm also a big Kurt Weill fan. So
I am too. Yeah. I want to go back to a couple of the pieces of music that you commend to our Adagio listeners. There's Strauss's Rosenkavalier Suite, which you were part of the production team for before you headed to Boston. You did that with the Cincinnati Pops. I think that's the greatest suite from the most overblown opera that I know.
It is absolutely all the best moments in that opera in 20 minutes of music.
And that's all we need.
I get you there. I was the associate for both Eric Kunzel and the Cincinnati Pops and for Jesus Lopez Cobos, both of whom are no longer with us, with the Cincinnati Symphony. And as a result, I worked closely with the Telarc team. I'm sure you've got lots of Telarc representation on your really pioneers in digital recording. And I was score reader, and I was a voice of commentary when discussing whether that was an acceptable take or whether we needed to go back. And I did lots of projects with Kunzel because he was putting out 6 or 7 albums a year at that point. The industry was very different back then. And several programs with Jesus as well. And so that was the last one I worked on while I was already packing my bags and heading to Boston. So I thought about, but sorry, I have to say, I hope the listeners like the choices. It's really, that's the worst question you can ask me is like, what are your favorite pieces of music? I mean,
no, but not favorite, but things that are meaningful to you.
They are meaningful, and that's not meaningful because I got to be. It's meaningful because it's an example of an orchestra taken to its absolute limits. There are points, and you notice there's points that I think I had the last moment, the What Love Told Me movement from Mahler 3 too, which is another thing that means that to me. I love all sorts of music, and sometimes just like you don't know what you're hungry for, sometimes you want a light lunch, sometimes. But the things that I am always blown away by are the Strauss Mahler late 19th century things that say an orchestra can do this thing that is so far beyond what any of us can do individually. And for me, Rosenkavalier, that music, not so much the opera, but that music is so reflective of that.
It's glorious. You picked a composer who, in my 3 years of doing Fred Plotkin on Fridays, no one has picked this composer for anything ever, to my great surprise. Felix Mendelssohn, the Hebrides Overture.
That's really an oversight.
Yeah. But why do you think, where does Mendelssohn stand now in the public imagination, but also the imagination of people who make music?
Well, I think there's always been I think composers who have who had an apparently too happy a life always always have two
Though
strikes
he
against
died
them.
in his 40s, but
Yes, he did, but he died. He lived very happily up to the
he
point that he
died
died.
happy.
He was successful. He was recognized. He wrote tons of great music starting when he was a teenager.
Right.
You know, when you, it was funny. And again, if I were just picking separately pieces that had, you know, a lot of meaning for me, I don't know if I necessarily would have gone to the Hebrides, but when I look at the Strauss and Mahler that I'd already picked and then say, where did this all begin? I think, you know, Beethoven was the transitional romantic composer, and Mendelssohn may have been the first really purely, you know, his thoughts, what drove him, what inspired him from the beginning were those
Mhm.
things that Beethoven came to later in his compositional career. I think the Hebrides is just amazing. It's not quite as amazing as the Midsummer Night's Dream Overture, because if you can write like that when you're 18, I don't know where you
Yeah.
go. You have to die in your 40s. You've run out of things. Uh,
And yeah,
but you know, the Hebrides, he was what, 22, 23, something
yes.
like that, and that it starts to paint that darker part of the romantic imagination, the, you know, the little more threatening, a little more minor, a little more, you know. And I've always loved the piece. And one of the things that when we put out the Celtic album, which was my third album with the Boston Pops, we really wanted to make sure that it was represented, that classical, I hate to say real music, but you know, serious music that was written for orchestra was represented, not just, you
Mhm.
know, the soundtrack to Braveheart.
Yeah.
And that has, so, you know, that's one of the first serious pieces I put on disc with the Boston Pops, and I thought it fit in for those reasons. But I can't believe nobody else has ever picked Mendelssohn.
Neither Felix nor Fanny. And finally, among the pieces you picked one of my very favorites. And although you and I have never met before or spoken at all, the fact that one of your two Sondheims is Follies, which is something so meaningful to me. And you're the first person to pick this in the 3 years I've done this. Ray Vaughan Williams' The Lark Ascending is just, to me, the perfect piece of music.
It
And
is. It's
why, I mean, you don't have to defend it to me because I love it, but what made you pick that among your pieces?
Well, it's funny. I've always been I don't know if a total Anglophile, but certainly in love with the music of Vaughan Williams, and
Hmm.
that combination of that, like, English, you know, with the wind sweeping the fens,
Yeah.
sort of impressionist feel,
Hmm.
that has always just really really spoken to me, and I have done, at least for an American. You know, I also spent 10 years as principal conductor of one of the BBC orchestras.
Yes.
That was just this last up the pandemic, right at my last gig before everything stopped was
Mm.
actually a gig with the BBC Concert Orchestra. But I did lots of British music, as you can imagine, there, as well as lots of American music.
Hmm.
And I've done probably, you know, much more Vaughan Williams than the average American conductor, including PBS and the Utah Symphony. We did great performances of Odie,
Hmm.
the big oratorio that he wrote with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir.
Yeah.
And that's a piece I love. I love Job, A Mask for Dancing. I
Hmm.
even have done some of the symphonies that nobody ever does, as well as lots of twos and fives, you know.
Yeah.
But that, and I used to say, I've stopped saying this now because it sounds a little more morbid than it did when I was in my 20s, but my funeral piece, I wanted to be Thomas Tallis. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I
and
mean, it, I say this often. You've never heard me say this because we've never spoken, but I think that every person has within him or her a particular biology, whether it's the blood type or the heartbeat or the breathing pattern, that connects to particular composers. And my three are Rossini, Berlioz, and Ray Vaughan Williams.
that's a really interesting grouping, though,
Yeah, I
too.
know.
But you know, so with the Lark Ascending, you have all of those sounds and those harmonies and that evanescent, but in a very beautiful miniature. You
Yeah.
know, and I love the poetry connection to the Meredith poem,
Hmm.
and actually I love the piece so much that my my wife, Emily, is a very musical person, but not a musician. Uh, and she asked, I said, I would like to propose an offertory piece at our wedding. And she said, well, can you play it for me? I said, no, I'd rather you just trust me. And I'm going to do this. And I think that if there's ever, a piece that can connect you as the lark does directly to heaven, it's this
Yeah.
piece. And so she was mad at me afterwards because she said, you made me start crying. Well,
So I know we have a time constraint, and I respect that. I grew up working with unions, and therefore I want to conclude with something that brought me to this conversation in the first case. You, with the Boston Pops, on June 8th and 9th, are doing a program with Rick Steves, the famous travel writer. I don't know if you know that Rick and I have just published a book
I
together.
did. Rick told me about this.
I'm going to hold it up very briefly. Italy for Food Lovers. And it is our pandemic project, and it just came out, and it was a thrill to work with Rick. I'm very fond of him, and we found a lot of commonality. Two of them, we have the same birthday, but also our fathers both were piano tuners. What's the odds of that?
That's right there. You guys should get better acquainted.
I know that, but we've only been together for a half hour in our lives. We had coffee once in New York when he was passing through, but we have a virtual friendship and a telephone friendship, and it was the thrill to write this book with him. And you're doing a program, I imagine, about travel. And I'm going to quickly read down the program: the Strauss Emperor Waltz with cuts, Wagner's Siegfried's Rhine Journey.
Don't
That's quite a
with
trip.
Cuts part. You shouldn't have that.
Okay, I'm sorry. Never mind. Smetana the Moldau, Rimsky-Korsakov, part from Capriccio Espagnol, or perhaps the Cacciatore Concerto in D minor.
We're going to Armenia one day and Spain the other day. So
okay, and Vespri Siciliani, Verdi, Elgar Pomp and Circumstance, Grieg's Morning from the Peer Gynt Suite, Saint-Saëns Marche Militaire Française, and Beethoven's Ode to Joy. How did you program this concert? Is it about different countries?
This is an extant program that Rick has done before. He actually originally did with his the community orchestra in, I think, Bellingham, Washington,
yes,
which is where he's from, I believe, or still resides. And our orchestra did it, not with me. I was, I think, off guesting with Czech Phil, I think, at that point, a few years ago, again, before the pandemic. And I wanted to bring it back, but I asked him if we could adjust the repertoire a little bit and do more kind of full, not excerpts of things. And something, the Vespri Siciliani is new, for instance. The Moldau is being done in its entirety because I think it's really hard to do a tone poem that tells a specific story and leave large chunks of the river out. And we started talking about this, and he said, well, why do you want to do these pieces? I mean, he is very obviously tuned into a lot of arts and culture, but not specifically a musician. And I started explaining this program is based on that it's all 19th century, late 19th century musical nationalism. Basically, it's how music gave voice to people who were fighting for unification in the case of Italy and Germany, or separation in the case of like Bohemia with Smetana.
Vienna,
and those things, and how you basically give voice to patriotism and nationalist in the best sense of the word, ideals and so we started talking more about this, and it's actually something I'm very passionate about. I'm very interested in how music relates to the life around it. You don't need that. I mean, music, as what was it, Bernstein said, exists within its own sphere. You don't need that to love music or to be touched by it. But I find it absolutely fascinating what the circumstances were that caused people to write and accept this music. So we're talking a lot about the possibility of doing more things together. In this case, he comes out, sets a little bit of the scene in the Italy of the 1870s and the Viva Verdi and that sort of thing. But we're talking about doing other programs, including, he had an idea. He said, I'd love to do one about European art. And I said, this is perfect because we can actually echo and amplify movements in art, whether it's classicism, whether it's early romanticism, if it's Debussy and Monet. There's also music written specifically for art, like the Trittico Botticelliano of Respighi, which is one of my absolute favorite works of chamber music, like Matisse der Maler, like the Maxwell Davies Paul Klee pictures. I mean, you can go on forever.
And
so
don't leave out Arnold Schoenberg, who is a very good painter.
That's right. There's another connection. But the idea to be able to say, this is the movement that was sweet. This is what changed from the Renaissance into Baroque, and use architectural examples and say, and musical examples. This is, a few years later, because we're always a little behind the visual art movement. This is what happened. I think it's a fascinating thing to explore. So we're already talking about our next time together.
When I teach music to people who are not necessarily into it, but they may love the visual arts, I make parallels between composers and painters, not to say, or artists, not to say that the composer imitated the artist, but something about their music, their temperament, their life experience. And the big three I always start with are Bach and Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven and Michelangelo, and Mozart and Raphael. But I've also added Berlioz and Delacroix, and they're more like that, where if you respond to the painting and the emotions in the painting or sculpture, you may have a closer response to the music if you respond to that. So Keith, I'm making a pitch. If ever you want to do an evening about food, I'm your guy. Because there are huge connections between food and music in terms of the gastronomes and Verdi was a farmer, Rossini was a cook, Mendelssohn and Offenbach were not the best eaters. Beethoven had wanted nothing to do with food. He spoke about essen und fressen. In other words, you eat or you eat like an animal. He just didn't want to deal with that. Mozart and sweets and so on. But our lives in music connect to our greater lives. And if we understand the music is not something apart, but as part of who we are, it's another language, it's a universal language, I think that people come closer to music as a result. And you've brought it to millions of people. And I've never had the opportunity to express my gratitude to you for all that you do, but I know the impact is huge. And when I announced that you were going to be my guest today, I had a deluge of people saying, wow, you finally got Keith Lockhart. So thank you. Yeah.
How about we do it again soon, huh?
I'd love that. It would be a pleasure.
Good.
And keep up the good work. And yes,